Your new therapist is making sure your daughter never gets better. That was what an 11-year-old girl named Birdie Alcott said to Graham Whitaker, said it plainly, standing in the doorway of his study like she had every right in the world to be there. Graham's first instinct was to dismiss it. His second was to look at the child more carefully. She was small for her age, with knobby wrists and a second-hand cardigan that had been washed so many times the blue had gone gray. She was Eunice Alcott's granddaughter, Eunice, who had worked in this house for 14 years, who knew exactly how Graham liked his coffee and where every memory lived in every room of the River Oaks estate. Birdie had been staying with her grandmother for 3 weeks now, ever since her mother took a travel nursing assignment in Montana and sent her daughter south to Houston with 2 suitcases and a library card. Graham had barely noticed her beyond polite hellos in the hallways. He was noticing her now. "That is a very serious thing to say," he told her, keeping his voice even. Birdie didn't flinch, I know. He asked her what she meant. She told him she'd explain if he'd listen, and because something in the girl's steadiness reminded him of the way his late wife Fiona had looked, when she'd already decided something and was only waiting for the rest of the world to catch up, Graham Whitaker sat down and listened. He hadn't slept well since the accident, 18 months ago now. A wet November road outside Austin, a truck that ran a red light, and the singular before and after that restructured every remaining day of his life. Fiona had been killed on impact. His daughter Ellis, 9 years old and strapped into the back seat with a chapter book open on her lap, had walked out of the wreck without a scratch that any doctor could find. But she hadn't spoken since. The specialist called it selective mutism, brought on by acute trauma. Ellis could hear. She could read and write and nod and shake her head and communicate volumes with the particular angle of her chin. She went to her classes at Claremont Elementary, did her homework, moved through the days like a small, careful ghost. What she would not do, what she seemed genuinely unable to do, was produce a sound with her voice. Graham had tried everything, 3 different speech therapists, a child psychologist in Houston and another one flown in from New York. A somatic trauma specialist who worked through movement and art. None of it had produced anything except a child who was increasingly skilled at communicating her polite refusal to cooperate. Then 8 weeks ago, Dr. Archie Voss, Ellis's regular pediatric speech therapist, had mentioned a colleague in Dallas, a specialist in pediatric trauma communication. Her name was Rowena Dahl. "She works differently than most practitioners," Archie had explained, his voice carrying the measured caution of a professional recommending something he wasn't entirely certain about. "More intensive. She integrates into the child's daily environment rather than conducting sessions in a clinical setting. It's unorthodox, but the outcomes can be remarkable." Graham had done his research. Rowena Dahl held a doctorate in communication sciences from Vanderbilt, and a list of credentials that scrolled down the screen for longer than he expected. Her testimonials were effusive. Her waiting list was 18 months long. She had made an exception for Ellis. Looking back, he would wonder why that hadn't stopped him. Rowena arrived on a Tuesday morning in early April, and the house responded to her the way houses sometimes respond to certain people, by seeming to exhale. She was 43, with dark hair cut close to her jaw and an unhurried manner that suggested both competence and warmth simultaneously. She shook Graham's hand with the ease of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and spoke to Ellis without crouching or adjusting her voice, which Ellis seemed to appreciate. "I don't need you to talk," she told Ellis on that first day. "I need you to show me what you love." Ellis had taken her to the sunroom, where Fiona's old watercolor supplies still lived on a shelf beside the window. That alone made Graham trust Rowena more than he had trusted anyone in a long time. She moved into the guest house that same week. The arrangement was practical. Her method required daily continuity, she explained, not hourly sessions with gaps in between. Graham told himself he agreed because of Ellis. He told himself that for several weeks. It was partly true. The presence of another adult in the house was, on its own, a relief he hadn't expected to feel. Someone to talk with on the terrace after Ellis went to sleep. Someone who asked thoughtful questions about his work and actually listened to the answers. Someone who brought the house back into something resembling motion. Dr. Voss continued his weekly check-ins, though Graham noticed he and Rowena had developed the particular politeness of two people who fundamentally disagreed about something and were exercising careful restraint about it. What Graham didn't notice, not yet, was the small, serious girl in the borrowed cardigan who was watching all of it with the quiet attention of someone who has learned that the most important information is usually the information nobody bothers to hide. Birdie had been watching Ellis for 2 weeks before she said anything to anyone. She wasn't spying. She simply paid attention. Her mother called it a gift, her teacher called it unsettling, and her grandmother Eunice called it that sharp eye of yours, with the complicated pride of someone who recognized a family trait. What Birdie noticed first was the laugh. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon. Rowena had an appointment at her Dallas clinic, a supervision requirement she'd explained to Graham, and Ellis was alone in the sunroom with her watercolors. Birdie had come to see if she wanted company. Ellis didn't hear her coming, and Ellis, who never made a sound that Birdie had ever witnessed, laughed. It was a small thing, a soft exhale of delight at something she was painting. When she looked up and saw Birdie in the doorway, her face went careful again. But Birdie had heard it. She didn't say anything. She just sat down across from Ellis and picked up a paintbrush and pretended she hadn't heard anything at all. Ellis watched her for a moment, then returned to her painting. 20 minutes later, Ellis pointed at a color she wanted and said, very quietly, almost under her breath, "That one." 2 words, barely audible, gone almost before they arrived. Birdie handed her the color. Neither of them acknowledged it. But Birdie had heard that too. Over the next several days, she paid closer attention to when Ellis made sounds and when she didn't. The pattern became impossible to dismiss. Ellis was silent when Rowena was present, not shy, but silent in the way of someone following a rule they had been taught to believe was necessary for their own protection. On a Thursday evening, Birdie was helping Eunice set the dinner table when she heard Rowena and Ellis in the therapy room. The door was half open, and the hallway carried sound easily. "Remember what happens when you try to rush it," Rowena was saying, her voice gentle and certain. "Remember what the doctors found. If you push before you're truly ready, you could lock the silence in permanently. Your body would stop trying to heal and simply accept the damage as normal." A silence, then the small sound of Ellis's pencil on paper. "That's exactly right," Rowena said. "We wait until your body tells us it's safe. You're not ready yet, and that is not a failure. That is wisdom. We don't fight what our nervous system knows." Birdie stood in the hallway with a stack of plates and felt something cold settle in her chest. She set the table and helped Eunice with the bread and said nothing to anyone. But she began keeping notes on her tablet, dates, times, what she'd heard and where. Something her mother had taught her back when they lived in an apartment with a difficult neighbor. If something bothers you, write it down. The people who can actually help will always want details. Birdie was 11 years old, and she understood, without knowing the clinical term for what Rowena was doing, that you cannot lose a voice you still have unless something outside you takes it away. She came to Graham's study on a Friday morning when Rowena was in session with Ellis and Eunice was at the market. She told him what she'd heard. She told him about the laugh and the 2 words in the sunroom. She told him about the pattern, present, silent, absent, sound. She told him about Rowena's voice in the hallway, warm and certain and completely, deliberately wrong about how voices and healing work. Graham listened. When she finished, he thanked her, and she could see in his eyes that he wasn't going to act immediately, that he was already constructing reasons why an 11-year-old had probably misunderstood something. "I know you might not believe me," Birdie said, "but Ellis talks, Mr. Whitaker. She talked to me. She just doesn't do it when Ms. Rowena can hear." She left before he could answer. He told himself Birdie had misheard. He told himself she was a child, perceptive, yes, but without the experience to interpret what she'd observed correctly. He told himself these things for 4 days. During those 4 days, he began for the first time to actually watch. He watched the way Ellis's eyes tracked to Rowena when Graham asked her a question, not a glance, but a check, a brief seeking of permission that happened so fast he'd been dismissing it as nothing. He watched the way Rowena's hand rested on Ellis's shoulder in a way that looked protective and was, he now thought, something else entirely. He watched the way Ellis's whole body loosened the moment Rowena left a room. A release around her shoulders and jaw that Graham had assumed was simply how his daughter existed now. He thought about what Dr. Voss had said 3 weeks ago, in a conversation Graham had mentally filed under professional jealousy. Silence isn't always safety. Sometimes it's a wall. Rowena had dismissed it smoothly. Graham had let her. On a Tuesday afternoon, when Rowena left for her weekly administrative call, Graham went to the guest house. He felt the wrongness of using his key and went in anyway. The interior was neat. Professional books on the shelves, diplomas framed precisely on the wall, nothing out of place until he opened the bottom drawer of the small desk by the window. The notebook was green, spiral-bound. He recognized it as the kind Rowena carried to their sessions. He sat down on the edge of the bed and read. The first pages were genuine clinical notes, detailed, careful, the kind of record a dedicated therapist keeps. Somewhere around week 3, the language shifted. E produced spontaneous vocalization in the sunroom today, while believed to be unobserved. Intervened with reinforcement of risk protocol. She responded appropriately. Continued to deepen the protection framework. Disrupting it at this stage would undermine progress significantly. Progress. He read that word 3 times. G is developing emotional dependency on therapeutic presence in the household. Maintain professional warmth. This attachment is useful and should be allowed to develop naturally. Dr. Voss remains a liability. Will recommend to G that outside consultations during active treatment introduce conflicting signals that confuse the child's nervous system. Frame as standard clinical protocol. E attempted to vocalize with the Alcott girl during art time. Redirected successfully before full sound emerged. Must increase monitoring of unstructured contact periods. Graham sat in Rowena's guest house with the notebook in his hands and felt the floor shift under everything he thought he knew about the past 8 weeks. He heard footsteps on the path outside. He had just enough time to replace the notebook and close the drawer before the door opened. Rowena stood in the doorway. Her expression moved through surprise, hurt, and something colder so quickly he almost missed the third thing. Graham, her voice stayed gentle, what are you doing in here? Finding out what I should have found out sooner, he said. What followed was the most controlled conversation Graham had ever been part of. Rowena was extraordinary. He would give her that. She had an explanation ready for every page of the notebook, a clinical framework that made each damning sentence sound like a misunderstood technical term. She spoke with the ease of someone who had prepared for exactly this. The protection framework is a recognized technique in trauma-informed communication work, she explained, leaning against the doorframe with her arms relaxed. We build from within the child's existing belief system before we challenge it. I understand how those notes read out of context. How do they read in context? Graham asked. The warm smile stayed in place. Like a therapist who cares deeply about this child and has been watching her father's grief get in the way of what the recovery actually requires. He felt the pull of it, the reasonableness of her, the reminder of everything she'd seemed to give them. Then he remembered. E attempted to vocalize with the Alcott girl during art time. Redirected successfully. I want you to leave, he said, today. The smile didn't disappear, it simply changed, became something cooler and more honest. You're going to shatter everything Ellis has built, Rowena said quietly. She trusts me completely. If I leave without proper transition, she'll interpret it as another abandonment. You'll set her back months, possibly to the beginning. A pause. And I wonder how Dr. Voss will receive your concerns, given the documented reservations you expressed to me about his methodology 2 weeks ago. I have notes on those conversations as well, Graham. Dated and detailed. The implication sat between them. Neither of them had noticed the guest house door had drifted back open. Neither of them saw Birdie standing on the garden path, her tablet in both hands, looking at the ground with the careful stillness of a child trying very hard to be invisible. Eunice found out when Birdie came back to the kitchen and set the tablet quietly on the counter. I recorded the last part, Birdie said, starting from when she mentioned the dated notes. Eunice listened once, then she called Dr. Voss. Within the hour, Rowena was escorted to the guest house to pack by the estate manager Graham, called from his study, where he sat with his hands flat on the desk, and his jaw set with the effort of holding something very large very still. Rowena left without incident. She paused once at the main gate and looked back at the house. Then she got in her car and drove away. The days that followed had the particular texture of aftermath, when the crisis is resolved, but the damage is still being carefully measured. Ellis retreated, her confusion visible in the way she watched Graham's face whenever he entered a room, searching for information she didn't know how to ask for. He told her what had happened in terms a 9-year-old could hold, that Ms. Rowena hadn't been honest with them, that she had been asked to leave, that none of it was Ellis's fault in any way that mattered. Ellis watched him. She didn't speak, but she didn't look away either. Dr. Voss came the next morning. He sat with Ellis in the sunroom, and this time there was no one in the hallway, monitoring what she gave away. He found Graham afterward. "She had been speaking," Dr. Voss said, managing his own emotion with visible effort. "Not to me yet, but the housekeeper's granddaughter, Birdie. Ellis has been talking to her in whispers during their art sessions, for at least 2 weeks, from what I can piece together." He paused. Rowena knew. She was intercepting it. Every small breakthrough was reframed to Ellis as evidence that she had pushed too hard and frightened her own nervous system. The fear she constructed in that child was meticulous. Another pause. "Ellis isn't broken, Graham. She's been taught to believe that using her voice could hurt her. That's different. That's something we can actually work with." It was a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after Rowena left, when it happened. Graham was in the kitchen with his coffee. From the sunroom came the sound of 2 children talking, not whispering. Talking. He didn't move. He stood at the counter and held his breath and listened to his daughter's voice, thin, a little careful still, the voice of someone testing uncertain ground, telling Birdie about a painting she wanted to make. "A big one," Ellis was saying. "Like a whole wall. My mom used to say houses should have murals." "That's a beautiful idea," Birdie said. "What would you put on it?" A pause. "Then birds, I think, because of your name." Graham set his coffee cup down very quietly and stood at the counter and did not move for a long time. When Eunice mentioned in mid-July that her daughter's contract in Montana was ending and she and Birdie would be returning to their apartment in Garland, Graham found he couldn't let the sentence finish. "Don't," he said. Eunice looked at him over her reading glasses. "The garage apartment has been sitting empty for 2 years," he said. "It's large, its own entrance, its own garden. And Ellis," he stopped, started again. "I don't want Ellis to lose her. I can't ask Birdie to lose this either." Eunice was quiet for a moment. "My daughter would need a reason to come back to Houston rather than following the next contract. She's practical." "The foundation I'm establishing in Fiona's name," Graham said. "Community arts programs for children across the city. I've been looking for someone to lead outreach for 4 months and haven't found the right person." He met Eunice's eyes. "Is your daughter good with people?" Eunice smiled for the first time in what felt like weeks. "She's Birdie's mother," she said simply. "What do you think?" Rowena Dahl filed a civil complaint against Graham in October, claiming defamation and breach of contract. The letter arrived on a Thursday and made him very tired for approximately 1 day. Then his attorney heard the recording Birdie had made and watched 2 short videos Birdie had quietly taken on her tablet during therapy sessions. She hadn't mentioned those until she was asked if there was anything else and sent a response. The complaint was withdrawn within 2 weeks. The state licensing board opened a formal investigation. A journalist at the Houston Chronicle, given access to documentation through Graham's attorney, found 2 other families with parallel experiences and wrote the kind of story that names systems and patterns and the gaps that allowed someone like Rowena to move between vulnerable households undetected. The regulatory response was slow, as regulatory responses are, but it came. Through all of it, Graham tried to protect Ellis from the noise. He managed it better than he expected, partly because Ellis had Birdie, and partly because she had Dr. Voss, and partly because she was, as it turned out, considerably tougher than anyone had given her credit for. It was Birdie who had settled the question of whether to go public at all. She had come to Graham's study on a Sunday afternoon. She did this sometimes now, with the directness she'd had that very first morning, and asked whether there were other children Rowena had done this to. Graham had said he believed so. Then you should tell people, Bertie said, so she can't find the next one. He had looked at this girl, 11 years old, sharp-eyed, still wearing second-hand things, though the cardigans were newer now, because Eunice had bought her one for her birthday, and thought about Fiona, who had always said that the clearest moral vision she ever encountered lived in children who hadn't yet learned to talk themselves out of what they plainly saw. "You're right," he said. Fiona Whitaker had believed, with the stubborn conviction of someone who loved beautiful things and wanted them accessible to everyone, that art was not a luxury. She had served on 3 nonprofit boards. She had dragged Graham to gallery openings in neighborhoods he'd never visited before meeting her and made him stand in front of paintings until he understood what she saw in them. In the last year of her life, she had talked about a warehouse in the East End of Houston she wanted to help convert, studios and classrooms, and a wall large enough for someone to paint a real mural on. The Fiona Whitaker Creative Center opened the following spring. Ellis stood beside her father at the ribbon and cut it herself with the small silver scissors Graham had found in Fiona's sewing basket. She was 10 now, and she spoke in full sentences to most people most of the time, though she still had days when words required more effort than others, and on those days she and Bertie communicated in the quiet shorthand of 2 people who had learned each other before language was required. Graham gave a short speech at the opening. He talked about Fiona and what she had believed. He talked about what community means and why beauty matters and how the hardest things sometimes point, in time, toward the most necessary ones. He did not talk about Rowena. That wasn't what the day was for. Later, when the speeches were over and the center was full of people and light was coming through the tall windows the way Fiona would have arranged it, Graham found Bertie standing alone in front of the mural. It covered the entire east wall. Birds in flight over a landscape that was partly Houston and partly a place that didn't exist anywhere except in the imagination of a child who had needed somewhere to put everything she felt, grief and anger, and the stubborn, unreasonable insistence on something better. Ellis had designed it. A team of local artists had painted it over 3 weeks. In the lower right corner, small enough that you had to step close to find it, were 2 sets of initials and a year. EW plus BA. Graham stood beside Bertie and looked at the wall for a long time. "She wanted to put your name on it," he said. Bertie studied the birds. "I know. I told her she didn't have to." "She wanted to." Bertie nodded slowly. "Yeah, a pause, she told me." Graham looked at the girl beside him, this serious, careful child who had walked into his study in a too-big coat and said the plainest, most important thing, who had listened and recorded and waited with the patience of someone who understood that truth needs to arrive at the right moment and the right person in order to actually land. And he thought about how close they had come to not having this day at all. "Thank you," he said, "for what you said to me that morning in the study." Bertie shrugged with the particular awkwardness of a child receiving gratitude she doesn't know what to do with. "You listened," she said, as if that was equally important, as if it was. Across the room, Ellis was showing a group of younger children how to mix watercolors. Her voice was clear and easy, and she laughed once at something a small boy said, and the sound traveled all the way across the building and reached Graham where he stood, exactly the way it used to. He heard it and thought, "There she is. There is my daughter." And just like that, on a bright spring morning in a place built for the person they both missed and would always miss, the last of the silence finally let go.